She walked into the dealership just after 10 on a bright Wednesday morning. The air was crisp, the sun high, and the polished glass facade of Hampton Elite Motors gleamed like a monument to wealth and status. Inside, a fleet of luxury vehicles sparkled under showroom lights: Bentleys, Ferraris, Porsches, each one a statement of power and exclusivity. No one looked twice at her at first. Dressed in faded blue jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days, Helen Monroe didn't exactly fit the typical profile of a high-end car buyer. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, and she wore no visible jewelry or designer labels. She looked, by all appearances, like a schoolteacher stopping by to ask for directions, or so the staff assumed. As Helen approached a vehicle near the center of the showroom, a sleek, silver Aston Martin coupe priced well over $300,000, she drew the attention of Craig Dalton, the dealership's veteran sales manager. With his neatly pressed suit, silk tie, and polished leather shoes, Craig carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone who prided himself on spotting serious clients at a glance. And in his eyes, Helen Monroe clearly wasn't one. He walked over slowly, scanning her from head to toe, lips curling into a faint smirk. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "but I think you might be in the wrong place. The used lot is 3 blocks east." Helen blinked, caught off guard. "Actually, I was just hoping to ask about this model here," she replied politely, gesturing toward the Aston Martin. Craig didn't budge. "These vehicles start at over $300,000, he said, glancing around as if looking for a manager to escort her out. "They're not for just browsing." Behind him, 2 younger salesmen chuckled quietly, pretending to busy themselves with paperwork. A few customers nearby looked over, intrigued by the scene. Helen felt her cheeks flush, not out of embarrassment, but from a mix of disbelief and the creeping sting of humiliation. "I see," she said softly. Without arguing, she turned and walked out of the dealership, her back straight, her dignity intact, though her spirit had taken a hit. No one noticed the quiet strength behind her eyes or the grace in her restraint. To them, she was just another window shopper, someone with champagne tastes on a beer budget. Not worth the time. What they didn't know, and didn't bother to ask, was that Helen wasn't just anyone. She was the founder of the Monroe Hope Foundation, a national nonprofit that had spent nearly 2 decades supporting children with disabilities and had raised over $60 million in funding for specialized therapy, education, and housing. She had built the organization from scratch after earning a master's in special education and had worked tirelessly to turn it into one of the most respected advocacy groups in the country. They also didn't know she had the means to pay cash for that Aston Martin, or 10 of them if she felt like it. But Helen had never cared much for putting on a show. She believed in keeping life simple, and her clothing reflected that. She dressed for comfort, not status. But that day, Craig Dalton and the staff at Hampton Elite Motors saw only what they wanted to see, a woman in jeans. And based solely on that, they decided she didn't belong. It was a judgment born from habit, a reflex that, unfortunately, many still carry. Appearances, after all, are easy. But sometimes, the most powerful people walk quietly and wear sneakers. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the windows of the Monroe estate, a sprawling, understated home nestled on 5 quiet acres just outside Boston. It wasn't ostentatious, despite being worth several $million. The house, like its owners, didn't advertise its wealth. The stone walkway, the wraparound porch, the old oak trees, everything about it whispered grace rather than shouted prestige. Inside, Helen Monroe stepped into her husband's home office, the events of the morning still fresh in her mind. Her face, usually composed and calm, was taut with a quiet frustration. Across the room, Charles Monroe, CEO of Monroe Innovations and one of the leading minds in renewable energy technology, looked up from his desk. Tall, with silvering hair and the kind of stillness that comes from years of commanding boardrooms, he immediately sensed something was wrong. He set his reading glasses down and came around to meet her. "What happened?" he asked gently. Helen sat in the leather armchair across from his desk, folded her hands in her lap, and took a deep breath. "I stopped by Hampton Elite Motors this morning," she began. "Thought I might take a look at that Aston Martin. You know, for Caroline's 60th next month." Charles raised an eyebrow. Caroline was Helen's sister, a retired oncology nurse who had just completed her final round of treatment for breast cancer. The car had been a dream of hers for years, and Helen had decided she was going to make that dream come true. "I walked in," Helen continued, "and before I could say much of anything, the sales manager took one look at me and made it very clear I didn't belong there." She recounted the scene, the dismissive tone, the sneers, the other salesmen chuckling behind their desks. She described how she had been ushered toward the exit like someone trying to sneak into a private party without an invitation. Charles listened in silence, but his jaw tightened with every word. "It's not about me," Helen said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I can walk away from things like that. I've dealt with judgment before. But it bothers me deeply that there are people who face that kind of treatment every day, people who can't just shrug it off. People without the security or confidence to know that the problem isn't with them." She paused, then added, "And it bothers me that people like that man are still making decisions based on clothing and first impressions." Charles leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. He had seen his wife in 100 different settings: fundraisers, boardrooms, classrooms, hospital visits. No matter where she was, she carried herself with quiet authority. The idea that someone had tried to diminish her based on her jeans and t-shirt didn't sit well with him. "So," he said after a long pause, "what would you like to do about it?" Helen gave a small smile. "Part of me wants to just buy the car somewhere else and never look back. But then I think of that young man, Daniel, the only one there who treated me with any decency. And I think of all the people like me who walk into places and get turned away for no good reason." She looked Charles in the eye. "I don't want revenge. I want understanding. I want awareness." Charles nodded, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Then maybe we give them a little education." Helen laughed softly. "Nothing dramatic. No buying the whole dealership or firing anyone." "No, no," Charles said, raising a hand. "Something better. Something that sticks." And so, husband and wife began to craft a plan. Not to shame, not to punish, but to open some eyes. To remind people that dignity isn't worn on your sleeve, and true wealth has little to do with price tags. Tomorrow, Helen wouldn't be the one walking through those showroom doors. But the lesson? That was just getting started. The next morning dawned bright and crisp, the kind of New England day that made the leaves sparkle and the pavement shine. At Hampton Elite Motors, sales manager Craig Dalton arrived early, coffee in hand, feeling rather pleased with himself. The dealership was immaculate, as always, its floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing millions of dollars worth of precision engineering. Bentleys, Lamborghinis, Ferraris. The kind of showroom where status wasn't just admired, it was expected. Yesterday's little encounter with the casually dressed woman was already a fading memory, one he had even laughed about with his co-workers over drinks that night. "Some people just don't know their place," he had quipped. At precisely 10:17 a.m., something unusual happened. The steady hum of chatter in the showroom came to a sudden stop as a car unlike any other glided into view outside. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Heads turned. A Rolls Royce Phantom extended wheelbase, finished in a custom deep midnight blue, pulled to a smooth stop directly in front of the main entrance. The paint shimmered in the sunlight, subtly changing tone with every angle. Even Craig, who'd grown numb to the glamour of luxury cars, felt his heart skip a beat. This wasn't just a car. It was a statement. The driver stepped out, dressed in a dark uniform with white gloves, and walked around to open the rear passenger door. With military precision, he pulled it open. Out stepped a man who, even without introduction, commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, he moved with quiet authority. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his calm, focused expression told everyone he wasn't here to waste time. Craig was on him immediately. "Good morning, sir," he called out, straightening his tie and quickening his pace. "Welcome to Hampton Elite Motors. Craig Dalton, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us." The man extended a firm hand. "Charles Monroe," he said simply. The name rang a faint bell in Craig's mind, but he couldn't place it, not that it mattered. The man had arrived in a $1.2 million vehicle with a private chauffeur. That spoke louder than any business card. "What brings you in today, Mr. Monroe?" Craig asked, already picturing commission checks in his future. "I'm here about a specific vehicle," Charles replied. "The midnight blue Aston Martin coupe. My wife was here yesterday to inquire about it." Craig blinked, briefly thrown. "Your wife?" "I'm not sure. Perhaps one of my associates helped her." "No," Charles said flatly. "You did. Or rather, you refused to." Silence settled like a fog. "She was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt," Charles continued. "You suggested she head over to the used lot. You told her this dealership wasn't for people like her." Now Craig's smile was frozen in place. A drop of sweat began to creep down the back of his neck. I wasn't aware," he stammered. Across the room, the young salesman Daniel, who had quietly watched the exchange the day before, stepped forward. "She was polite, specific, and respectful," he said. "She asked about that car, and she was dismissed because of how she looked." Craig turned pale. His smooth veneer had cracked. Around them, the entire showroom had gone quiet. Staff and customers alike listened closely, unsure what would happen next. Charles Monroe looked around, then returned his gaze to Craig. "My wife is Helen Monroe," he said, "founder of the Monroe Hope Foundation. She spent the last 20 years serving children with disabilities. And yes, she dresses simply. Not because she has to, but because she believes in living with humility." Craig tried to speak, but nothing came. "I came here today not just to buy a car," Charles added, voice steady. "I came to see how you treat people when you think no one important is watching." And with that, the entire dealership held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The air inside Hampton Elite Motors was thick with tension. As Charles Monroe's calm but powerful words echoed through the glass showroom, every eye was fixed on him and Craig Dalton, the now visibly shaken sales manager. Just yesterday, Craig had dismissed a woman for not looking the part. Today, he was learning she was not only wealthy, but also a woman of remarkable compassion and influence. Behind them, the midnight blue Aston Martin coupe gleamed quietly, just as it had when Helen had first admired it in jeans and sneakers. Charles turned his attention to Richard Hammond, the dealership's owner, who had just emerged from his office, drawn by the uncomfortable silence and the unmistakable sense that something important was unfolding. "Mr. Monroe," Hammond began, his voice tense, "please allow me to apologize. I wasn't aware of how your wife was treated. This absolutely does not reflect our values." Charles nodded slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "I understand that mission statements and window decals say one thing. But how your people behave when no one's watching? That's the real brand." Craig stood frozen, his shoulders stiff. There was no easy way to backpedal. No elegant recovery. He'd revealed more about his character in one brief encounter than any resume ever could. "I came here prepared to purchase this Aston Martin for my sister-in-law," Charles continued. "Helen wanted it as a gift. But I also had plans to replace 7 of our corporate vehicles and add 2 more to our personal collection. 9 cars total. That kind of investment doesn't come lightly." Hammond's eyes widened. A sale of that size could carry the dealership's quarterly performance in one stroke. But the implication was clear: unless something changed, that sale might vanish in a puff of pride and prejudice. Charles paused, then said, "However, I'm not interested in doing business with people who don't treat others with dignity." Hammond quickly stepped in. "We're committed to making this right, Mr. Monroe. Whatever it takes." Charles nodded slowly. "Good. Then here's what I suggest. He turned to Craig. "You'll be volunteering with the Monroe Hope Foundation for the next month. Not as a guest. As part of the support team. Setup, cleanup, helping the kids and their families, whatever's needed." Craig looked as if he'd swallowed a stone. "Sir, Charles raised a hand, cutting him off. "Consider it an opportunity. The kids will teach you more than any luxury sales seminar ever could." Then, addressing Hammond, "You should also consider bias awareness training for your entire team. I know a few excellent consultants who can help with that." Hammond nodded vigorously. "Absolutely. We'll bring someone in this quarter." Finally, Charles turned to the young salesman, Daniel. "You treated my wife with kindness when no one else did. I'd like you to handle all the paperwork for the Aston Martin." Daniel blinked in surprise. "Me? Thank you, Mr. Monroe. I'd be honored." Charles smiled faintly. "Good. Let's make it official." As the small crowd of staff and onlookers began to dissipate, the message lingered in the air like the scent of motor oil and fine leather. People don't always remember what you say, but they remember how you made them feel. And for Craig Dalton, that was a truth written in bold, permanent ink. Later that day, as Charles and Daniel reviewed the purchase details in Hammond's office, Craig remained in the showroom, silent, still, humbled. He wasn't fired. But he'd been given something more uncomfortable than termination, a chance to change. And it wouldn't come from selling cars to millionaires. It would come from pushing wheelchairs, setting up folding chairs, and listening to stories from kids who had every reason to complain but never did. That was where the real value lived. A month had passed since the quiet storm swept through Hampton Elite Motors. A month since Charles Monroe had walked through the glass doors and turned a luxury dealership upside down with a few carefully chosen words and one powerful lesson. Craig Dalton, the confident, polished sales manager once so sure of his instincts, was no longer the man who had dismissed Helen Monroe with a smirk. It hadn't happened overnight. At first, volunteering at the Monroe Hope Foundation had felt like a punishment. On his first day, Craig had been assigned to assist with event setup at a community sports program for children with physical disabilities. Folding chairs, unloading equipment, filling water bottles. Things he hadn't done since his early 20s. But what made it truly humbling wasn't the work, it was the people. Children who had every reason to feel bitter, but didn't. Parents who carried exhaustion and hope in equal measure. Volunteers who showed up week after week, not for praise, but because they believed in the mission. Then there was Thomas, a 9-year-old boy in a wheelchair with boundless energy and a wicked sense of humor. Thomas had taken a liking to Craig right away, nicknaming him Mr. Ty and insisting he help coach his adaptive basketball team. Craig, who'd never played a minute of basketball in his life, soon found himself on the court, trying and failing to keep up with kids who had mastered skills far beyond what he expected. "They're just kids," Helen had told him one afternoon as they packed up equipment. "They want what every kid wants, to be seen. To be included. That's not too much to ask." By week 3, something inside Craig had started to shift. He began showing up early, staying late. He stopped worrying about how much time he was required to volunteer. The work was hard, and at times emotional, but it was real. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was contributing to something bigger than a sales quota. At the Monroe Foundation's annual gala, held in a grand Boston hotel ballroom, Craig stood near the entrance, not in a tailored suit, but in the volunteer staff uniform. He greeted guests, helped direct traffic, and even assisted a family in navigating the crowded floor with their child's wheelchair. He had grown quieter, more thoughtful. And when Helen approached him during a break, wearing a modest navy dress and her signature warm smile, he stood up a little straighter, not out of pride, but out of newfound respect. "How's it going, Mr. Ty?" she asked gently. Craig chuckled. "Well, according to Thomas, my basketball form is still tragic, but I'm learning." Helen's smile deepened. "That's what counts." There was a pause. Then Craig cleared his throat. Mrs. Monroe, I want to say again, I'm truly sorry. Not just for how I treated you, but for what it said about how I see people. I thought I was being efficient. But I wasn't. I was being arrogant. She nodded slowly. That kind of reflection takes courage, Craig. And change takes time. But you're showing up. That matters. Across the room, Charles joined them, placing a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder. He looked Craig in the eye. I hear you've been working with Richard on retraining the dealership staff, Charles said. Yes, sir, Craig replied. We've started bringing in speakers on bias awareness. Daniel and I are also rewriting our customer engagement guidelines. Charles smiled. Good to hear. Because as it happens, I never did replace that corporate fleet. 9 vehicles, if you're still interested. Craig blinked in surprise. You'd let me handle that. If you're ready. A moment passed. Then Craig nodded. I am. Later that night, as he helped Thomas into position for a photo, the boy grinned up at him and said, You know what, Mr. Ty? You're pretty cool for a grown-up. Craig laughed. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he'd earned the compliment. In a world where appearances often take center stage, it's easy to forget one of life's oldest and most powerful truths: you can't judge a book by its cover. This story reminds us that dignity, compassion, and integrity aren't defined by clothing labels or bank accounts. They're revealed in how we treat others, especially those we assume have nothing to offer us. For older adults, many of whom have experienced their own share of being underestimated or overlooked, this story strikes a deep chord. We've lived long enough to know that people's worth can't be measured in dollars or designer shoes. What matters most is character. And character, like trust, is earned in small, everyday moments. The lesson here is not just about prejudice, it's about presence. About slowing down, looking deeper, and asking ourselves, am I seeing the whole person? Or just their reflection in the mirror of my own assumptions? The story also reminds us that it's never too late to change. Craig Dalton's transformation didn't happen through punishment, but through exposure, through meaningful contact with people he once saw as outsiders. He didn't just learn a business lesson. He learned a human one. In the end, life has a way of humbling us, and if we let it, that humility can be the beginning of wisdom. No matter our age or status, we all benefit from stepping back, listening more, and remembering that the most extraordinary souls often walk quietly among us, in jeans and sneakers.